Beneath the beautiful greenery of New York's Flushing Meadows-Corona Park are millions upon millions of pounds of forgotten ash. These are the remains of a colossal 100-foot tall ash dump that once choked the air and haunted the lives of an entire community. You see, around the turn of the century, when everything was powered by coal, the city needed a place to dispose of its massive quantities of smoldering byproducts, which in turn cast Queens into a literal cloud of filth. This was the reality of the notorious Corona ash dump, once described as the closest thing imaginable to a literal hell on earth. It's now little more than a forgotten memory. So join me as we engrave its secretive past. This is the story of New York's lost ash dump. I'm your host Ryan Socash, and you're watching It's History. The 19th century saw New York as a bustling port city, but towards the end of that century, with the onset of the Industrial Revolution, everything changed. And this wasn't a gradual change, it was turbocharged, and not unique to New York, as factories, hungry for resources, sprang up across America. But that being said, New York's industrialization was more dramatic, as its massive natural harbor made it the obvious epicenter. Steel mills devoured raw materials and spewed out finished goods. Ships, now larger and more efficient thanks to steam power, flooded the harbor. There was cotton from the south, timber from the north, and iron ore mined in the fresh territories. And all of this action converged right in New York. In effect, the city became a middleman, a processing center for a nation on the rise. But with every ton of coal burned along the way, smoking hot ash needed to be disposed of somewhere. And it's here that we need to talk a little bit about ash dumps. You see, the history of ash dumps is closely intertwined with the evolution of human civilization and our relationship with waste management. Early human settlements often disposed of their waste, including ash from fires, in designated areas away from living spaces. However, as populations grew and urbanization intensified, industrial waste became a part of the equation. So the management of ash became more organized to prevent fires and, to a degree, pollution. In the late 19th century, industries primarily transported their ash waste to dumps using horse-drawn carts and railroads. Horse-drawn carts were a standard means of transportation for local businesses and industries since they could easily navigate the narrow streets, collecting ash waste from factories, businesses, and even residential areas, and then transporting it to nearby dumps or designated disposal sites. Railroads also played a crucial role in transporting ash, especially for industries further from the city center or nearby lines. In fact, many industrial factories had their own rail sidings, which you can still see, often abandoned, throughout New York if you know where to look. These sidings allowed for access to nearby rail yards, where they could load ash onto rail cars for transport to larger disposal sites outside of the city. But as time passed, more city regulations were enforced, and people burning coal for domestic purposes were also required to send their ash to the dump. This is why old photos show streets throughout New York lined with ash barrels, where people dumped not only ashes from their furnaces, but all of their waste, like rotting food, household refuse, and apparently occasional human remains. Beyond that, city waste was collected by sanitation workers called ashmen, who emptied this waste into so-called hiking vehicles and took it to Queens, where it would continue to smolder in the infamous Valley of Ashes. The Corona ash dump wasn't your average trash heap. This monstrosity was fueled by the city's insatiable appetite for coal. For every ton burned in factories and homes, Corona became its designated tomb. For over 26 years, barges piled in, spewing ash that grew into a rancid landscape of hills and ridges. In the early years, about 110 loads of garbage were dumped into Flushing Meadows by the Brooklyn Ash Removal Company alone. Then, at its peak, Corona sprawled across 300 acres, a wasteland choked by dust and shrouded in a perpetual haze. One particularly notorious mound, nicknamed Mount Corona, towered a staggering 100 feet into the sky, a site that some considered to be a grim monument to unchecked industry. The dump made such a strong impression that even Francis Scott Fitzgerald used it as a symbol of decay for the industrial society, with a special emphasis on the waste produced by the rich in The Great Gatsby. Recalling, quote, "This is the Valley of Ashes, a fantastic farm where ashes grow like wheat into ridges and hills and grotesque gardens, where ashes take the form of houses and chimneys and rising smoke, and finally, with a transcendent effort, of men who move dimly and already crumbling through the powdery air." And now, if that quote doesn't paint a vivid enough picture for you, allow me to put things a little more literally. An estimated 50 million cubic yards of ash, enough to fill over 39,000 Olympic swimming pools, choked the landscape of the Corona ash dump in its prime. But it wasn't even really the looks that mattered. It was the stench. The foul odor and smoke were constant companions for nearby residents, turning their lives into a daily struggle. The smell, it was nasty for a reason. The Corona ash dump was a severe public health hazard, a breeding ground for disease and poison. The former Corona ash dump posed significant health consequences for nearby residents and workers due to air and water pollution. This is because the inhalation of particulate matter from burning coal and industrial waste led to respiratory issues such as asthma and bronchitis. Additionally, the release of heavy metals and other contaminants into the surrounding soil and waterways posed long-term health risks, including potential exposure to carcinogens and toxins capable of causing neurological disorders. There was really no limit to what people would burn back then. These were the days when sending something to the dump meant that it was gone for good. As I mentioned earlier, there were even instances of people sending human remains to the dump. But you could also send other things that contained personal information, like old passports, letters, banking documents, and so on, as many believed that the documents would just burn up in the hot ash. And whereas I don't know if that was a good approach or not, that's definitely no longer the case in our digital age, especially when your personal information ends up on the internet. Just as a quick aside, in our modern world, we have to make a much bigger effort for information to disappear. However, I do have at least one fantastic solution to make it happen. A kind of digital ash dump, if you will. In fact, it's very easy. With the help of our sponsor, Delete Me, old addresses, phone numbers, and everything else can be removed from the internet. If left unattended, this information is sold to data brokers, and any stranger on the web can misuse your information in some rather terrible ways. So it's better to get everything removed. Delete Me is a fantastic service that will erase your personal data from people search websites. I'm talking about hundreds of data brokers selling your information. It's an ongoing process. Once they clean house, they'll keep scanning for new data that shows up so they can remove that as well. As the presenter of a rapidly growing YouTube channel, it's been so reassuring to have control over my own digital footprint, especially in a day and age when we're all really just one personal view away from having our occupations attacked. That's right, nowadays we are very exposed to dangers such as identity theft, scams, or hacks. Also, political views and opinions have become an increasing source of risk for both individuals and organizations. And I don't know about you, but I prefer not to take the risk. So thanks to Delete Me, I could remove listings containing my vital records like former addresses, professional background, and even family photos. With Delete Me's ongoing monitoring, I feel confident that I can continue enjoying the privacy everyone deserves. I'd encourage you to do the same. So get 20% off Delete Me US customer plans when you go to joindeleteme.com/Socash and use promo code Socash at checkout. That's joindeleteme.com/Socash, promo code Socash. Making matters worse, the monstrous Corona ash dump wasn't just an eyesore. It became a haven for New York City's most unwelcome residents: rats. The mountain of ash offered a perfect breeding ground, a wasteland teeming with discarded food scraps and hiding places. These weren't your average alley rats either. The Corona ash dump fostered a supersized population, feasting on the city's waste and multiplying rapidly. By the 1930s, the entire situation reached a tipping point. Emboldened by their growing numbers, rats spilled out of the dump and into the surrounding neighborhoods. Homes and businesses were overrun, and food supplies were contaminated. The city was facing a full-blown rodent war. Newspapers ran headlines screaming of rat plagues and armies of vermin. Fear and disgust gripped New York. Hence, the city launched a multi-pronged attack on the rat menace. Extermination campaigns were waged, with traps and poisons deployed in a desperate attempt to stem the tide. Fortunately, change was on the horizon, as the city would find the perfect pretext for redevelopment upon winning the bid to host the 1939 World's Fair. The city purchased the ash dump from the Brooklyn Ash Removal Company in 1934. As I trust you recall from various previous episodes on the topic, city planner Robert Moses seized the moment to remove one of New York's nastiest landmarks, transforming the entire area into one of the region's most wonderful landscapes. Yet, in a way, he was only reverting the space to something much closer to its original form. To be clear, have a look at this historic map. You'll notice that before the peak of the Industrial Revolution, Flushing Meadows was a gorgeous salt marsh. In fact, the name derives from the Dutch word Vlissingen, which means flowing water or stream. The Dutch originally settled the area in the early 17th century and named it Vlissingen, a name inspired by a town in the Netherlands. After looking at a few images of that town, you wouldn't need to be a historian to understand that New York settlers chose a very flattering name, and they most probably did not imagine that area would become the city dump. Anyhow, over time, the name evolved into Flushing as English became much more prevalent in the area. That being said, the transformation from Corona Ash Dump to Flushing Meadows Park was not an easy feat. Many believe that the city relocated 50 million cubic tons of garbage to a different location, when in reality, landfills weren't relocated back then, and the sheer volume of ash would have made such a feat nearly impossible. What Moses did was much more ingenious, and it involved transforming the very nature of the dump itself. So based on the limited documentation available, here's a breakdown of what likely happened. And as always, please clarify in the comments section below if you have better sources. A significant portion of the ash likely remained on site. Moses' plan probably involved using some ash as a base layer to fill the lower lying areas around the dump. This technique, though not ideal by today's standards, was common practice at the time. From there, landscapers worked on grading and reshaping, likely creating a more even topography. This would have involved moving some of the ash within the dump's footprint to create a smoother, less imposing landscape. Finally, we can suspect that sanitary landfill techniques, while rudimentary compared to modern landfills, might very well have implemented some basic measures, such as extracting and relocating obviously harmful substances. This could have also involved covering portions of the ash with soil to prevent dust and limit exposure. It's important to remember that environmental regulations were lax back then, and that the project's primary goal was to create a usable park, not a complete environmental remediation. I'd also add that, surprisingly, some believed the trash heap should remain, with one Standard Union article from 1931 implying that the dump was wrongly demonized to justify political moves and redevelopment, emphasizing that the dump used cutting-edge technology to limit pollution. Reading, quote, "The ash train had puffed away and was seen in the distance being unloaded under hydraulic pressure. 2 nozzles were attached to tractors, and the loads were being emptied by water pressure, eliminating dust and manpower." The article also quotes Superintendent William Free, who told reporters, quote, "The dump is disinfected every night." And then there was Gus Wilkins from the dump who claimed, quote, "Although rats, big ones, too, were prevalent a few years ago, rat experts had eliminated most of them," explaining a process commenced by placing poison fruit or candy in the area that is lethal to rats but would only sicken humans or house pets. Perhaps the bigger issue for the men quoted in this article was that the redevelopment would cost them their jobs. Everyone else was far more optimistic about the prospect. For example, a clubhouse was raising funds to build what was projected to be the world's largest golf area on site, or in modern times, the Corona Golf Club, whereas the Brooklyn Daily declared that the area would become a playground for for children. Ultimately, the Corona ash dump became the world of the future and remains a beautiful park to this very day. One American novelist, Jonathan Lethem, once said, "Outside of probably hell, there is no literal landscape as forlorn and soul-crushing as the ash dumps of Corona Queens." Most people probably found it hard to believe that this was the same place that once had a monorail, the Magic Skyway, or the world's first picture phone, igniting a sense of wonder and possibility about the future we now occupy. Deep below the soil of Flushing Meadows Park remain the ashes of America's past, and as grotesque a notion as that ash dump may have been for those living nearby it at the time, this was a necessary evil in the evolution of our modern world. And with that, I thank you all for watching. Until next time, I'm Ryan Socash, signing off.